Hi, I'm Modern Synthesis, also known as Mr. Pink, or that guy who makes all those Tyranids you like so much. When I'm not making Tyranids, I also make sculpting tutorials. I believe that green stuffing is really easy if you just get the right tips, so I try to give out those tips to folks. In this series of sculpting videos, I'm going to focus on sculpting Tyranids to get everyone ready for the Leviathan box drop, which is coming very soon. I believe that Tyranids are one of the easiest armies in 40k to convert and make your own, and I'm going to show you how to do that by going through all of the different structures that make up a Tyranid, from carapace plates to ribs to vents, all that kind of stuff. Because once you know how to make all these different elements in green stuff, it makes it a lot easier to marry together different conversions that you might do with a Tyranid. And I think that with these tools, you're going to be converting some really awesome Tyranids as soon as you get your hands on those new Leviathan models. So I broke this down per different structure in the Tyranid. First, we're going to do the carapace plates because that's one of the most prevalent structures on a Tyranid. And then in my next video in a couple of weeks, we're going to do vents. So just sit back and relax and let me show you how to make some beautiful monsters.
How to sculpt, ooh baby, how to sculpt. Yeah.
In this episode, we'll be focusing on how to sculpt Tyranids. As you can see, I do all kinds of weird, gribbly Tyranid stuff with green stuff, and it's really not that hard. So that's what we're doing today. So we'll get rid of these guys, and we'll get this little warrior here, and then we will get Terry. Terry is a Tyranid. You wouldn't know it to look at him, and he probably doesn't know it himself, but we're going to awaken him to his Nid nature in this video. He's going to be our go-to for sculpting all kinds of different textures on one model to turn this crypt horror into a Tyranid. So when it comes to sculpting Tyranids, there are three main components to a Tyranid physiology that you need to really mark it out as a Tyranid. The first, most obvious thing is the carapace on the back. Next, you have the kind of like Tyranid flesh. I guess this is the chitin and this is carapace. I don't know. I guess it's all chitin. You have these carapace plates and then you have the actual skin, flesh of the Tyranid, and the segmented breaks. That's a big part. And then these vascular vent things. I think Games Workshop sometimes calls them gill structures that are in the various Tyranid limbs and on Tyranid weapons. So those are like the basic three things that you need to differentiate a Tyranid. If you have those, you're getting pretty far. I guess you'd also need ribs because they have these kind of like skeletal looking exposed ribs. So yeah, we're going to go over how to sculpt all those different things and then touch on some other stuff while we do it. I'm going to begin by mixing up some putty. So I use Greenstuff combined with Aves Apoxie Sculpt because I find that the two mixed together give a really good consistency. So I do 40% Greenstuff and 60% Aves, maybe a little more of the Aves because it's cheaper. One thing you'll know if you've been watching my previous sculpting tutorial videos, when mixing up green stuff, though it looks like you're supposed to mix it one part to one part, what you actually want to do is you want to have slightly more yellow than blue. I wouldn't recommend buying green stuff in tape, but if you can only get green stuff in tape form, you'll see that they give you a little bit more yellow than they give you blue. I buy green stuff in tubes, not in ribbon, because I don't like it touching together. And I store it in these spice jars just because they're magnetic and I can like stick them on like metal stuff in my studio. So I got my green stuff. I'm going to take about the equivalent amount of epoxy putty. Don't have to worry about mixing epoxy sculpt with green stuff. There's no like tricks or things you gotta get right. When I'm mixing it together, I tend to fold the epoxy sculpt into the green stuff simply because the green stuff doesn't give off silt and the epoxy sculpt does. So it's slightly less messy. When you're mixing this stuff, you probably should be wearing gloves. I don't all the time. I'm wearing one today because I have a cut on my hand, but yeah, it's recommended because this stuff is not great for your body. So yeah, make your choice. The good thing is that even if you're wearing gloves to mix it up, you can always just take them off once you get it on the model because then you're just touching it with your tools and not with your fingers. Just going to knead that together until it makes a nice even color. Keep your fingers wet while you're mixing so that it doesn't stick to your fingers or your gloves. So let's get started with our good friend Terry, the soon-to-be Tyranid. What you can see here is that I've already done a little bit of pre-work on Terry. For example, this is a really shitty hoof, but this is like meant to be like a hoof structure that I made here. He's got some pre-sculpted gill structures on his leg here, one pre-sculpted armor plate here on his knee, and then he's got this piece of plastic card sticking out of his face, and that's going to be an armature for a horn. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to show you a couple of different ways to sculpt a couple of different structures. Like for example, there are two different ways to sculpt the gills. One is you sculpt them first and then you sculpt like a piece around them, and the other is you sculpt the piece all together and you just like cut in the gills while you're doing it. If you've seen my how to sculpt organic armor plating tutorial video, you'll see that I show you two ways to do it. One plate at a time or sculpting a whole bunch bunch of them at once you feel more comfortable. So I'll show you both of those in this video. But to try and make it so that I'm not shoving my fingers into the stuff I'm sculpting while I'm working on it, I'm going to attach Terry to a handy dandy paint handle so that can hold on to him while I worry about the sculpting. I got my Greenstuff all mixed up, and one tip that I tend to repeat for people is that when you're working with Greenstuff, it's common to mix more Greenstuff than you need, but Greenstuff is reactive to hot and cold. So if you want Greenstuff to cure faster, you can apply heat to it with like a halogen bulb or something like that. And if you want it to cure slower, you can put it in the cold, like in a fridge or in a freezer. So if you mix too much Greenstuff, take off a little bit that you're going to use and take the rest and pop it in your freezer, and then it should be good for 1 to 2 days, depending on how cold your freezer is. So I'm going to take my own advice, take off about that much, and put the rest in my handy dandy bar fridge. My next super important sculpting tip is to always lube your tools. You've seen that while I've been mixing this up, I've been wetting my hands with water to make sure that the green stuff isn't sticking to them. Same thing when you're applying the green stuff to the model. You want to make sure that it doesn't stick to your tools. My lubricant of choice is Nivea. It's a hand cream. You can get it like almost everywhere in the world. You can feel free to use other hand creams, but this just works so well and it doesn't leave residue. You do not have to wash your models after. Learn more about that in my tutorial on it. I'll link to it. It's great because your tools just slide right over the putty and none of them stick to your tools, doesn't stick to your skin, and you don't have to wash it after, so it's brilliant. So what I do is I get my handy dandy Nivea container. I take some of the cream, I apply it to the back of my hand because that's easily accessible as I need it, because you only need a little bit on your tool at a time. So I apply the Nivea cream to the back of my hand as a kind of palette so that I can grab it when I need it. And all you need in terms of lubrication on your tool is just like a thin film. So you can just like kind of wipe your tool through it, wipe off most of the white, and you can see that there's just oil on there like a film. That's more than enough. So let's start off with Carapace, because Tyranid Carapace is really one of the single most important items for differentiating a Tyranid from just like a normal creature. Here we have one armor plate, and if you're getting started on sculpting Tyranid armor plates, I would highly recommend that you do it one at a time. The way you want to do it is you want to look at the armor plates on the model. So let's hold up this warrior leg for reference. And if you see here, the armor plates overlap each other. So they start closest to the knee, and then this one goes over that one, and then this one goes over that one, and this one goes over that one. So that's why I've sculpted on Terry. The first plate I've sculpted is on the knee, and the next plate I would sculpt would be this one up here, because then it's very easy to sculpt one overlapping the other. So I'll show you that now. Again, I've got a whole video on sculpting organic armor where I show you like the large version of it, sculpting in plasticine, and then I show you it up close, sculpting it with epoxy putty. But for the sake of this video, let's do it again. So I got my one diamond shaped plate. I'm going to take my putty and apply it just above that on the leg. So the first step here is once you got the ball of putty on there, you want to flatten it. And there's a couple of different tools you can use for this. I really like a spoon tool, like a curved, I think this is called a Beal wax carver. I have a whole video on different sculpting tools and I'll link to that. But yeah, I love the spoon tool, and I actually have a smaller version of it here, which might be useful for this. Very smooth. But you can also use we used to just call them Games Workshop sculpting tool, a knife tool that they used to sell. I don't think they sell these anymore, but just like a blade tool to flatten it. Or you can, if you're getting fancy, which I highly recommend doing, you can use a silicone shaper. These are brilliant for sculpting. Again, I mentioned them in my tools video, and I'm probably going to do an update on that soon. These are amazing for pushing putty around. So why don't we start with that? So I have my Nivea on the back of my hand. I'm going to take my tool and just run it through there really quick. Put a thin skim on there. You don't need white blobs or anything like that. Just a bit is enough. So I'm going to come back here and I'm just going to flatten this out. Not super flat because we're still going to want an edge to it, but we can cut that in later. And what we're watching for here is we want a line of plates to kind of go up the side of the leg here. So we want it to extend to the point of the previous one. The only downside to sculpting plates one at a time like this is that you can get a bit of like height scale creep. Like this one's pretty flat, but then this one bulges up a bit, and then the next one bulges up a bit even more. So you just got to watch for that. It's less likely to happen when you're sculpting all the plates at once, which I'll show you after. You don't want it to kind of develop this like hump, because if you look at the existing Tyranid leg, it's pretty uniform. Like there's a bit of a curve there between the different plates, but it's not like a big bulge. So I would caution that. And one way to make that happen is just that as you're smoothing it out, because each plate is going to be buried under the previous plate, we didn't get a really good look at the first one here on Terry, but a lot of detail, a lot of kind of like thickness up here at the front of the plate, and at the back it basically just like vanishes. I just smeared it into his leg. You can see the smear up here. So that's what you want to do with this. You want to keep the most of the putty at the front, near where you're going to get that edge in there, and then you want to kind of just smear the back stuff back. so that it doesn't add any additional bulk or height. And in fact, because we're just doing one plate here, we can just cut the rest off there because it's just kind of getting in the way. So again, lube my tool with some Nivea and just kind of cut this stuff away so that it's not adding additional bulk. I'll add it to my Greenstuff ball for later. There we go. Back with my silicone shaper. And you can see on the armor plate that there's like a raised ridge in the middle. I didn't get the line on that perfectly straight, but that's something you want to watch for when you're sculpting yours. So you want to flatten one side, flatten the other side, and leave kind of a ridge in the middle. Don't flatten it too much at the front because you need that cut, the break between the two plates. You just want to bring that point down. So yeah, what you're basically doing is if you looked at this from above, it would be a diamond. Like you have a point here and you have up, up, and then you have the slopes going in behind. So I just need a little more putty over on this side. So I'll push it back from the front here, preserving that edge. And when it comes to putting a point on the front of this plate, as much as possible, you want to line it up with the one below. Okay, so this is getting a bit wieldy now. So I'm going to go in with my little knife tool or my little spoon tool, move it up. And to get that kind of curve to them, you can take the spoon tool and do something like this. Keeping it flat, can take the knife and do like the flat edge of the knife to flatten it out and get that that ridge down the middle of the plate. Another way to do this is to get the rough shape and then just take the knife and cut it. Like, just cut the extra off. Well, that's working. Clean it up a bit with the spoon, flatten it out because it's getting kind of like a bulge at the end here. Because you do want, this plate comes out and then it cuts in here. You want this plate to go slightly beyond the edge of the one below it and then cut back. So I'm going to bring some more of that putty that I smeared onto his leg down towards the front because I need it. So just extend this out. Keep flattening it. The spoon. Don't flatten it too much because it'll eliminate the seam here. And if it's getting like thick at the front, you need more at the back, you can kind of like just push it back there. Terry, you're going to be a beautiful Tyranid. I can see it now. Just defining that curve, keeping the point at the front, making sure it's not too bulgy at that point. The curve is really nice on this side. I don't love it so much on this side. One of the real forgiving things about sculpting Tyranids is because they're organic, it's not so bad if things are not perfectly symmetrical. If you think about sculpting a Space Marine, sculpting power armor, you think about the left side and the right side of the power armor, they really need to be identical because it was produced in a factory somewhere and it's supposed to be geometric. But you can kind of get away with less of that when you're sculpting organics, which I like, and it's very forgiving for beginner sculptors. Just gotta keep that point pointed towards the end there. Gotta do my two faces and keep of the plate and keep that ridge in the middle by just running the flat part of the blade over it. So I'd say I've roughly got it now. I just have to define these edges. You don't want to go too far back on the leg with this one plate just because we're going to be putting another one on top. That's going to be the edge of the plate. Smearing it down so it's not too tall. And this is a place where you can just take your knife tool and just cut it. Push it a little bit further with my spoon tool. And then flatten it out with the flat side of the knife. Clean it up with the spoon. It's a lot of poking back and forth. It's looking pretty good. Just looking at it from above, the curve's not great. This side's pretty close. And then same thing like I did before. I'll just flatten it with the knife. And the key thing here is that I've seen when some people sculpt armor plates, you don't ever want the cut on the last one can be vertical, like 90 degrees, but you don't ever want to just cut it here because then it doesn't give the idea that this one is sliding, that the lower plate is sliding under the upper plate. So you can cut it, but then you want to come in with your tool and kind of tease in under the edge. You don't want to have it so that like the edge of the upper armor plate is like sticking out major, but just to give the suggestion. So you line your blade up with like the flat of the previous plate, and you just kind of like angle it up a little bit and just kind of like run it softly along that seam to kind of cut in underneath. Just a little bit. You can kind of do that with this, but this is a little thicker, so it might pop that plate up a bit more, which we don't love. Another thing to learn about sculpting, good enough is good enough. if you've got it to a place where you're happy, stop sculpting, because you'll do what I just did, which is screw it up and have to go back and do it again. All right, I think you have the idea here. So yeah, you cut that, you can kind of like make it a bit curved, and then just use your flat of the blade tool or flat of like a silicone shaper to just kind of flatten the two faces of the armor plate with that ridge running down the middle. Also, realistically, if you're not loving your plate, you can come back and cut it once it's dry with an X-Acto or something. All right, good enough. And then I'm going to cut this plate in and up so it goes just beyond the lower one, and then the one on top can go even further out. Give it a little bit of an edge here to stick out underneath the next one that is going to go on. Same thing here, make sure it's got a bit of an edge sticking out. The last thing that you want to make sure is that the surface of the plate is pretty smooth, and you can just do that by like lubing up the flat of a knife blade, just kind of running it along the surface. You can also do that with your handy dandy silicone shaper, just running the flat of it along each of the two faces on the either side of the ridge. See, that's pretty good. And then just make sure that it's very flat back here, because this stuff's all going to be hidden by subsequent plates, but you don't want it to be too bulky when you put the putty over top. All right, so that's a second plate there on top of the first one. So honestly, if you've never sculpted plates before and you don't want to be frustrated, do this. Set the model aside, let it dry for at least 6 hours, preferably 12. Then come back and sculpt the next one. You don't have to worry about wasting your putty because you were smart and you put it in the freezer. So you can bring it out in 6 hours and you can do the next one. Likely this will be dry in like 3, maximum 4 hours. If you're in a very, very cold workshop, it'll take longer to set, but you're probably good to come and sculpt another one after 3 hours. So you can go work on something else while this is sitting aside. If you saw my article that got published in 28 Mag, I compared sculpting to painting in that it's best to handle it in layers, not all at once. You wouldn't paint a model all in one go. You do a base coat, you let the model dry. You do like some highlights, you let the model dry. You might wash it, you let the model dry. In stages like that. Exact same thing for sculpting. Let the model set in between and you won't be frustrated, because it's super frustrating to sculpt something like this, be very happy with it, and then be like, I'm going to keep sculpting, I'm going to sculpt everything. And then you wind up screwing that up. Whereas if you wait for it to set, it's a save file. It's never going to go wrong on you. For the sake of expedience, I'm going to keep sculpting on this model, and I'll probably regret it later. So that was the first way to do armor plates. So I'm going to show you the slightly faster way to do armor plates, but it does take some patience and a little bit of skill, and that is sculpting them all at once. So you can see here what I've done is I've filled in the creature's back, and I've introduced kind of a ridge there. I just did this roughly with some putty just to fill in a gap here, and I just put that ridge in because to kind of guide myself, to kind of like line it up towards the head. I'm going to take my big blob of putty, I'm going to press it down. In fact, I'm going to use my finger for this because who cares? Sometimes your finger's the best tool. If you're ever wondering, like if you're doing this kind of work on Tyranids and you're like, oh man, like I could put like 18 plates here, like how many should I do? I highly recommend just like getting an actual model and looking at it. So for example, I've got a warrior carapace here, and a warrior carapace only has 3 armor plates in it. 1, 2, 3. That's a bit little for me. I tend to like a little more. This isn't to say that you can't do 4 or 5, but I would say that if a warrior has 3 plates and you're sculpting a warrior and then you give it 10 armor plates, it's going to start to not look so much like a Tyranid. This is a Ravener back piece that I've sculpted onto. You can see it also has 3 plates. When you jump up to, this is a venom throat back carapace, and I've kind of modified it, but you can see it has 1, 2, 3, and there was a 4th plate here that I kind of hacked up. So it's got more plates on its back. And then you go up to something like a hive tyrant. This is like a fancy lictor model, but I based it on a hive tyrant. 1, 2, 3, 4 armor plates. So that's a good indication. I think I'm going to go with 4 armor plates for this guy. Although, if I do 3, it'll be faster. Let's go with 3 armor plates. Sounds great. So he's about warrior size, both for the sake of consistency and for the sake of not having to sculpt too many armor plates. Don't ever do 2 armor plates. That would be in the category of too few to look like a Tyranid. Don't go too many. Don't do like 10, 12. Unless it's a very large Tyranid, like a Tyranid monstrous creature or a Trigon. Just that then you get too many section breaks and it'll start to not look so much like a Tyranid. And when you're sculpting this kind of stuff, try to look at like the lines of the body and try to follow the lines of the body. This is not a typical Tyranid body shape, but you can see that his back tapers towards this point. When you look at the armor plates on the warrior's back, they're pretty broad, like side to side. They're not very like skinny and pointy. So I'm going to try and keep that broad look. So the first thing you want to do when you've got the kind of like broad area covered with your putty is that you want to better define the shape of the carapace plates, because we're going to be sculpting many of them here. We've got to like define the shape of the whole area. I should probably have a little more putty and have it extend all the way up to the tip here, but oh well. What I've done here is I've got a little bit too little putty on the edge, whereas the armor plate looks like it's like almost meshing with the flesh. I want to have a little bit of a raised edge there. So I'm going to pull a little bit more putty over. I lost that ridge that I'd previously sculpted in, but I want to put it back in here as like a guide to the different armor plates. And the ridge, you want it to run from the base of the tail, where the tail would be, to the head. So that's the guide stars, whatever, for it. And this is getting to be a bit annoying, so I'm going to get a silicone shaper, big flat one, lube it up. Just use that to smooth out these plates and also introduce that ridge in the middle by just pushing it up in the middle. These plates are not going to be perfect, but they're going to give you the idea of how to do it on your own. Don't worry about what the surface looks like at this point, because you're going to come back and clean it up. Just want to get the rough shape. Tyranid armor plates are basically diamond shaped. So it's like a chevron. There's two lines that come to a point here, and then there's also like a point where they stop here, and then the rest of the armor plate goes up and tucks under the previous one. You see that it's not just like a triangle with like a base here. It's got these flat bits at the side. You can see it up here on the back carapace, same thing. Comes to a point, but it's also got these flat sides that kind of taper in and tuck under. So I need to introduce that here, where I'm working towards a kind of point down here, but I also need like the corners out at the sides. You can't just have it like go like straight up and under the other one, or else it'll look weird. So you can see the points starting to form there at the base. And one thing I didn't show on that smaller plate on the knee that I'll show here is how to texture the plates. This is more important the larger the plate is. On the smaller plates, you don't really need to texture them that much. But I'm doing a bit of texturing here when I take this little spoon tool and I rub it up against the plates like this. It's introducing like little ridges into the plates. You don't want them to be too noticeable, because then they're distracting and it'll mess with your painting. But you want there to be like a suggestion. Another way to do it is to take something like a rounded silicone shaper and run that, the rounded bit, up along it. And that will smooth it out while also introducing like the suggestion of these ridges. So you can see it's starting to come together here, this shape at the bottom end. I'm just cutting in underneath with the spoon tool to raise the plate away from the body a bit. You want to give the impression that it's kind of sitting out a bit, not just like flush with the skin. Organic doesn't have to be perfect on both sides. You'll drive yourself crazy trying to make it so. Also, as Tyranids shift, like if their bodies are twisted or whatever, the plates can stack differently. The Warriors are not a good example. Like on something like a Ravener, something like a Trigon, like a more sinuous Tyranid or something with a longer body, if you wanted to, you could have more of this plate showing and less showing on this side, more of this plate showing and less showing on that side, to kind of communicate that it's turning to one side. If this tail's curved and you're putting armor plates on it, you could, if the tail curved that way, these would all tuck in under each other and more of these would show out. So that's something to consider. Okay, so that's a pretty good end to that plate. So what I want to do now is I want to decide where my next plate is going to go. I just said that we're going to do 3 plates on this guy. So probably the second one would be there and the third one would be up there. Take a knife tool. Don't cut in at a 90-degree angle, because then you're going to make like a crevice. The cut between the plates will be too obvious and it won't look like the bottom plate is like nesting in underneath the top plate. So what you want to do is you want to go in not vertical, not horizontal, a little bit up from horizontal. And you want to go in on an angle so that it slopes down towards a point like that. You're going to clean this up later, introducing the shape to the plate. And notice that's not like a straight line. It's a bit of a curve. You could do, like, I think Tyranids straight lines. Actually, they're a bit of convex. They're the curve of the plate, whereas I tend to go a little more concave. It's a stylistic choice. Your call. You could make this more straight. And you can see they're starting to like lift away a bit from each other, but we're going to emphasize that. So going in almost like flat with your blade tool, we're just cutting in a bit more underneath and lifting up the plate above, giving it a little bit of height. And then once we've got that defined, we go to the plate below and we make sure that it's nesting in underneath. So we can see this line and it curves out. We don't want that because then it lines up here. So you can either go straight like that to cut in, or you can go in on a little bit of an angle. Your call. Again, stylistic choice. Warriors are pretty straight, so I'll go more or less straight in, but there is a bit of an angle there. And then just cut this little piece of putty out. And then try to do something kind of similar on the other side. Again, not going to be perfect, but ish. And then cut out that bit. Okay, so that looks a little wonk, but we can clean it up. Clean it up on this side. To raise it up a bit because it's a bit flat right now. And then another way that we can raise it up is kind of like, I don't know if it's an optical illusion, but we flatten the plate underneath more. So we just kind of like flatten it in and tuck it in underneath the upper one. And then what we want to do is we want to extend the upper plate that we just kind of defined the edge of out to the sides a bit. This one's getting a bit wide because we need the upper one to be even wider. I think this is where I would add more putty up top to make the upper one even bigger, but whatever. One thing to be careful of when doing this is that you don't want the edge of the plate here to have like a bulge right along the edge. That can happen because you like get in, you push it up, you get in, you push it up, you get in, you push it up, and it can make it so it's like flat and then it like pops up. So what you do to counter that is you take your blade tool and you just kind of run the flat of the blade over it to make it flat. And then I'm going to cut one more up higher. So 1 plate, 2 plate, and the 3rd plate will be like this. I think I went a little too 90 degrees there. I needed to do more 60. Okay, so I've roughly defined that. Go with the spoon tool and lift it up and better define it. You can also just like do that with the knife blade. Want to make sure that they're not connected here. Sometimes you can miss the connection point at the tip of the plate. Again, we need more putty here to build this plate out more, but what we can do now is we've got to cut this in underneath. So let's go from here. And then we're going to flatten this bit to go underneath the upper one like we did on the previous one. Flatten this bit. And yeah, that's basically how you do it. Once you get confident, you can do a bunch of them, but I wouldn't do more than like 4 or 5 at a time, because then as you're trying to like obsessively fix each plate, the putty's drying all the time, and you could get to the point where you're like, oh, I'm trapped because the putty's setting and I haven't finished doing all the detail on the plates. Start with 1, and then once you feel confident with 1, try doing 2. You feel confident with 2, try doing 3, and so on and so forth until you get up to your danger point. So you can see here that we've got that like stepping of the plates. In terms of putting detail on them, so like I said, you can take like a spoon tool and just kind of run over them like this to put like kind of loose ridges into them. But then of course you take a knife tool and you just very lightly hit the edge, pull a line up, and then smooth that out with a spoon tool or with the flat edge of a knife blade. Don't press very hard at all, but like you can put it in under the upper plate. You put the knife in there and you bring one of those serrations down, put a couple of nicks in the edge of the plate. Always want to smooth them out after because they tend to bulge up. Go down here, a couple this way, one this way. Don't ever do too many of these. A little goes a long way. I knew someone who would sculpt Tyranids and their plates were literally just like, yeah, look at all these, look at all these like sick cut, yeah. It gets to a point where that looks like a really old beat up Tyranid. If you want to do like a really old beat up Tyranid, like just say you're sculpting old One Eye, maybe a lot of striations will help your effect. I don't love it. I'd rather do like a few just to like add the suggestion of it. Another thing that you can mess with, Forge World does this a lot, is that, I think it was Simon Egan who did the Hierophants. You can also put like little divots in the armor plates. Are they just artifacts of how the armor plate is grown? Are they bullet holes? Who knows? But you can do like bigger ones. Just make sure you go in and flatten them after so it doesn't, unless you want them to be like bullet craters. And yeah, it just kind of gives a little more texture to the armor, because if it's too flat and perfect, it's going to start to look like inorganic armor. But yeah, so that's sculpting Tyranid armor plates. One at a time when you start, and then you can do many a time when you get more comfortable. So that's the first real thing that you need to know to be able to sculpt Tyranids. All right, that was my sculpting tutorial on how to make Tyranid armor plates. Hope you enjoyed it, and the next video is going to be all about doing the vascular vents, the kind of gill structures that Tyranids have. That'll be out in a couple of weeks. Make sure that you subscribe to the channel, maybe go through my other how to sculpt tutorials in my how to sculpt list, and I'll see you again soon. Thanks. Bye.